Out of every 10 Japanese pilots who flew combat missions in 1945, 9 never returned home, and they weren't even flying suicide missions. While the world focused on the terrifying kamikaze attacks, conventional Japanese pilots were dying at rates that made even those desperate tactics look survivable. The average life expectancy of a non-kamikaze pilot in the final year of the war was just 3 weeks. This is the forgotten story of why regular combat flying became more deadly than deliberately crashing into enemy ships. When 1945 began, the Japanese aviation program was already in freefall. The country that had once produced some of the world's most skilled pilots was now sending teenagers into combat with barely enough training to take off and land. What had happened to create this aviation disaster? Let's go back to 1943, when Japan began losing its veteran pilots faster than it could replace them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, which American pilots nicknamed, quote, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, unquote, had been particularly devastating. In a single day, Japan lost over 400 aircraft and 300 experienced pilots. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report. They were the instructors, squadron leaders, and combat veterans who should have been training the next generation. By early 1945, Japan's pilot training program had collapsed into chaos. Before the war, Japanese pilot training took 2 to 3 years and was among the most rigorous in the world. Student pilots logged hundreds of hours of flight time and received extensive combat instruction. By 1945, new pilots were being sent to combat units with as little as 40 hours of total flying time. And sometimes just 10 hours in the actual aircraft they would fly in battle. The aircraft themselves had become part of the problem. Japan's once superior fighter planes were now outmatched by American technology. But that wasn't the worst part. Critical materials shortages meant that aircraft were being built with inferior metals, substandard engines, and reduced structural integrity. The famous A6M0, which had dominated early Pacific battles, was now being constructed with such poor materials that wings would sometimes break off during normal flight maneuvers. Training aircraft were even more dangerous than combat planes. Japan was so desperate for flyable aircraft that they were using worn-out combat veterans as training machines. Student pilots were learning to fly in aircraft that had already survived multiple battles, with engines that could fail at any moment, and control surfaces damaged by enemy fire. More Japanese pilots died during training in 1945 than had died in combat during the entire first year of the war. The fuel crisis made everything worse. By 1945, Japan had so little aviation fuel that student pilots were often getting their first combat experience on their very first flights with a full fuel load. They had trained with partially filled tanks to conserve fuel, which completely changed how their aircraft handled. When they finally flew with full tanks in combat, the different weight distribution would cause them to lose control and crash. But it wasn't just inexperience killing these pilots. The strategic situation had become impossible. American bombers were now attacking Japan itself with massive formations of B-29 superfortresses, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs. A typical interception mission would pit a handful of inexperienced Japanese pilots in inferior aircraft against formations of hundreds of enemy planes flown by veteran American crews. The mathematics of aerial combat had turned completely against Japan. In early 1942, Japanese pilots enjoyed numerical superiority and flew better aircraft than their enemies. By 1945, they were outnumbered 10 to 1 or worse, flying aircraft that were outclassed in every performance category. American pilots had radar guidance, superior communications, and overwhelming firepower advantages. Can you imagine being a 19-year-old with 40 hours of flight time, sent up alone against a formation of 100 experienced enemy pilots? Japanese pilots were also facing a new type of ammunition that made their aircraft even more vulnerable. American forces had developed improved incendiary rounds that could ignite aviation fuel more effectively than earlier versions. A short burst from an American fighter could turn a Japanese aircraft into a flying torch within seconds. Since Japanese pilots rarely wore adequate protective gear and their aircraft lacked fire suppression systems, these fires were almost always fatal. Navigation had become another deadly problem. Many new pilots couldn't properly use their navigation equipment, which led to them getting lost during missions and running out of fuel over open ocean. Others would become separated from their formations and find themselves alone against multiple enemy aircraft. Without the experience to escape or fight effectively, they became easy targets for American pilots who were accumulating impressive kill tallies. The weather during 1945 created additional hazards. Typhoon season brought severe storms that inexperienced pilots couldn't handle. Many were ordered to fly missions despite dangerous weather conditions because Japan was so desperate to get aircraft into combat. Student pilots who had never flown in storms found themselves fighting both enemy aircraft and severe turbulence simultaneously. Radio communication problems made coordination impossible. Many Japanese aircraft in 1945 had faulty or missing radio equipment due to material shortages. Pilots couldn't warn each other about enemy positions, coordinate attacks, or call for help when in trouble. They flew blind into battles where American pilots had constant communication with ground controllers and radar operators who could vector them toward targets or away from danger. The psychological pressure on these young pilots was enormous. They knew they were inadequately trained and flying inferior equipment against overwhelming odds. Many had watched their instructors die in training accidents or seen entire squadrons wiped out in single missions. Unlike kamikaze pilots, who at least had the psychological comfort of knowing their deaths would serve a specific purpose, conventional pilots faced the prospect of dying uselessly in unwinnable battles. Aircraft care had gotten very bad and unsafe. The people who fixed planes were often as new to the job as the pilots, and there were almost no spare parts available. Planes were being kept working with used materials and makeshift fixes. Engines that needed major repairs were being used way longer than was safe. Many pilots died when their planes just broke apart while flying because of broken parts. The final factor was target prioritization by American forces. US pilots had learned to identify inexperienced Japanese pilots by their flying patterns and would specifically target them for easy kills. Veteran American aces would save the obviously inexperienced pilots for last, using them for target practice after destroying the few competent pilots in a formation. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the country's conventional aviation program had essentially ceased to exist. Entire flying schools had closed due to lack of aircraft, fuel, or qualified instructors. The few remaining experienced pilots were either dead, assigned to kamikaze units, or held in reserve for the expected invasion of the Japanese home islands. The 90% casualty rate among non-kamikaze pilots in 1945 represents one of the most complete military aviation disasters in history. These weren't pilots dying heroically in evenly matched combat. They were young men being sent to certain death in a futile attempt to slow an inevitable defeat. Their story reveals how quickly military aviation can collapse when training, equipment, and strategic situation all deteriorate simultaneously. Unlike the kamikaze pilots who chose death as a weapon, these conventional pilots died because their country's aviation system had failed them completely. What do you think made this situation even more tragic than the famous kamikaze attacks? Let us know in the comments below, and if this story shocked you as much as it did us, subscribe for more untold stories from aviation's darkest chapters. We'll see you in the next one.